A village grows a jazz festival, the evolution of COTA. I'm Spencer Reed, and I'm here to speak about an annually occurring musical event, the Delaware Water Gap Celebration of the Arts Jazz Festival, also called COTA. I'm here not only to speak, but in fact to celebrate our celebration of the arts, as I have been for over 4 decades. This year, 2018, having just participated in the 41st festival, my wife, Nancy Reed, who sings and plays bass, and I were the first act on the main stage at the very first festival in 1978. We have returned every year since, in September, on the weekend after Labor Day, to perform in and take part in what has become a tradition in my family, which is the underlying story here. That the Delaware Water Gap Celebration of the Arts Jazz Festival is much more than a musical concert. It is a wonderful, magical, social happening. Our annual festival has grown from an idea into an institution with far-reaching, long-lasting, and worthwhile consequences. The familial feeling that I have for this event is not unique. It is shared by many. I was invited to address you today, not only because I'm aware of the facts surrounding the topic, but because I'm an example of how a little jazz festival can not only greatly impact people's lives, but can indeed affect and even shape families and a community in many positive ways. I arrived on the scene before the first COTA Festival. In 1976, I was 21 years old and working as a guitar player in New York City. I was a skinny kid who grew up in the Bronx, in the projects. I moved here to Pennsylvania to play music at a resort, 6 nights a week, 52 weeks a year. We played popular music, long hours of playing music for lots of people, mostly vacationers from New York City. After living here for a while, a friend took me to the small nearby town of Delaware Water Gap to hear music at the bottom of the Fox, the Deer Head Inn, and the local Blue Note. How amazing to find 3 clubs featuring jazz in this tiny village. And these places were packed with listeners, sometimes even on weekdays. Initially, most striking to me were the residents of the Gap, many of whom wore clothing more in the style of the 1960s, though it was 1978. I made lots of new friends who still wore leather with fringes and bandanas around their heads. It brought me back to my early teenage years. The owners of these establishments, and a few others out of town too, openly encouraged us to play jazz, with the goal being to create music that had a higher cultural value, music whose primary motivation was to result in a performance that was art, and not necessarily commercial or easily saleable. One of these club owners was the late Ed Jobert, the owner of the Bottom of the Fox, who gave lots of musicians work almost every night of the week. Nancy and I played there every Friday for a while, around the time that Ed Jobert, saxophonist Phil Woods, and the late Rick Chamberlain, a virtuoso trombonist who grew up here, played with major jazz orchestras worldwide and performed with the New York City Ballet at Lincoln Center until his retirement. Those 3 cats founded Delaware Water Gap Celebration of the Arts, and apparently rather casually one afternoon. One night while I was performing at his club, on an intermission, Ed Jobert came over to me, put his arm around my shoulder, and asked me to play up the hill, in the street, for no money. We were going to put on a jazz festival. The proceeds, which ended up being only a few $100s, would benefit the town hall. To me, this was a show of good faith from all of the musicians to the regular residents of the town, many of whom we apparently kept up late at night, at least according to the local newspaper, with our music. I also felt that I was helping Ed show good faith to the then older township supervisors, as he was still a newcomer to town. When Ed asked me to play, he said, "I think it'll be good for you." These words ring in my ear. No truer words have ever been spoken to me. The site for us to play would be at the Castle Inn, with permission from the owner, the legendary Fred Waring himself. That's him in the back. If you're not familiar with Mr. Waring, he was dubbed the man who taught America to sing and operated a very successful music publishing company in the Castle Inn. Les Paul and many famous musicians played in Fred Waring's band. Rick Chamberlain created the Fred Waring Award and gave it to him the second year of the festival. Bob Dorough received that award the next year, and I'm truly honored and was thrilled to be the 32nd recipient of the Fred Waring Award for outstanding contributions to the arts and to the community. One memory of the first almost impromptu festival was when I was asked by Ed to help push the piano up the hill from the Fox to the performance site. I quickly conjured up that vision of that Laurel and Hardy movie when they moved that piano rather unsuccessfully, so I didn't go. I think they found a closer piano. A very, very special feature of the music scene in the Gap is that there are well-established, sometimes legendary musicians who are supremely generous and even glad to share the stage with their neighbors and those musicians who only get to play locally. I'd like to acknowledge the contribution of the early owners of the Deerhead Inn at this time, the late Bob and Fay Lair, who turned the Deerhead into a jazz club in the first place to start the scene in the 1950s. That's them there with Bob Dorough. Bob and Fay Lair also took, they sometimes hired musicians to play scheduled performances, but often gave up their stage to jam sessions, many, many impromptu jazz sessions where musicians were encouraged to play music simply for art's sake. Bob and Fay were also very active in the planning and execution of the first and many COTA festivals. The COTA and the Deerhead Inn audiences do experience unique performances. I have had the chance to hear and play with many musicians that were in my record collection while I was growing up because of the fertile space that the COTA Festival and the Deerhead provide. The core of these famous musicians, though numbering about 20, became the mentors to dozens of younger musicians who rapidly went on to share their knowledge with scores of others, today amounting to, no doubt, thousands. In the early 1980s, Phil Woods expanded COTA's community outreach by conceiving and establishing a student jazz orchestra, the COTA Cats, with the help of Professor Pat Dorian, comprised of participants from several schools throughout the region, that performs on stage every year at the festival. Each year, a composition is commissioned to be debuted by the COTA Cats Student Orchestra at the festival. It's very exciting for the students and for their families. Sometimes you can see that it's even more exciting for the families. From the success of the COTA Cats, Phil Woods went on to found COTA Camp Jazz, a one-week summer program for students of all ages, housed at the Church of the Mountain, the Deerhead Inn, and the Castle Inn. This is one more venture that is the result of extensive community cooperation, this time with the local church. Rick Chamberlain originally directed the camp, which quickly became a family event as Rick's daughter Lauren, a chef by trade and who now operates an antique store in the Gap, directed the camp in subsequent years. Through my exposure at the COTA Festival, I was approached by an officer from the local musicians union who asked me to help him provide music programs in schools that were funded by the Musicians Performance Trust Fund, a branch of the American Federation of Musicians. Even my own daughter, who is not a jazz musician, but does play classical violin, performed in one of the festivals in a string quartet accompanying my jazz trio. It was a very valuable, one-time family event, not only for me, but for the other musicians in my daughter's quartet who aren't jazz musicians, whose families attended that year's festival with special interest. But many of the young people who grew up here and graduated from the COTA program and the COTA Cat alumni have pursued careers in music. Dr. Matt Vashlishin not only plays in the festival every year, but has taken up the reins to run the Water Gap Orchestra, a perennial in the COTA program, founded and formerly directed by Phil Woods. Dr. Vashlishin also, wonderfully enough, currently directs the COTA Cats Student Jazz Band, in which he performed in high school. At this point, I'd like to add that the formation of the COTA Cat Student Jazz Band under Professor Pat Dorian led to the involvement of East Stroudsburg University. ESU has also partnered with the local jazz community in housing the Al Cohn Memorial Jazz Collection in its Kemp Library so that students and the public can have access to the recordings and artifacts that started with the legacy of the great saxophonist, composer Al Cohn, who played at the first and many COTA festivals. It was through the COTA Festival that I would interact with Al Cohn. He was very kind to me when I was very young, and one time in particular comes back to me that I was having a little trouble with my music on stage, and he told me to take my time, and we wouldn't start until I was absolutely ready. That was a very kind thing to do. East Stroudsburg University also continues to host and sponsor an annual Zootfest jazz event named after the tenor saxophonist Zoot Sims, in honor of his legacy to the Al Cohn Memorial Collection. The community feeling born from the COTA Festival continues to radiate well beyond our region as we proceed into our fourth decade and witness our second and third generation of participating musicians and audience members. One outstanding example is the Lance family, with 3 generations of musicians performing in the festival for over 3 decades, with all of them growing up in the area. One of the sons, David Lance, along with several other COTA prodigies, among them saxophonist Jay Ratman, vocalist Nashua Parkins, and bassist Evan Greger, after graduating from music schools around the country, have managed the very difficult migration to major cities as professional musicians. The whole community feels pride for these musicians who are indeed living the dream. Considering our small population, the number of local musicians that are on tour or who have migrated to major music centers as professionals or who still live here and make a living as performers and music teachers is astounding. We do live in a culturally rich area, though we might not have large neon signs, thank goodness, or fancy nightclubs or concert halls to display it. We recognize that many people are not aware of what is readily available here until they search deeper in their community. One of the 3 jazz clubs operating in the 1970s, only the Deerhead Inn continues to operate as a club dedicated not only to featuring live jazz, but to producing recordings under their own label. They are thriving under the current owners, Denny and Mary Carrick and Bob Mancuso, and continue to actively support the COTA Jazz Festival and COTA Camp Jazz. Another fortuitous aspect of our festival is the transition of ownership of the property on which the festival takes place. The audience sits on a grassy hillside owned by the borough of Delaware Water Gap. The Rick Chamberlain Stage and the Castle Inn are owned by Frank and Teresa Paccione, who, as they joyfully say, host the festival. Many, many volunteers and charitable donors make the festival possible. COTA is run by a board of directors that changes every year. More and more young people are getting involved. It is inspiring and heartwarming to see how many young musicians and their families treat this festival as an important event. We all know that it takes a village to raise a child. I've seen that a village can grow a jazz festival. Thank you very much.